When the German paratroopers finally took the ridge at dusk, they did not push on. They stopped. All day, a storm of fire had come out of the snowy woods above the village, and it had cost them dearly. So they were certain those woods must be full of Americans, dug in deep, backed by tanks. So they waited. They waited through the evening and into the night for reinforcements to clear an enemy that wasn't there, because the truth was almost impossible to believe. The force that had held up the opening blow of Hitler's last great offensive for nearly an entire day was 18 young American soldiers in foxholes, and by nightfall, most of them were wounded, and every one of them thought they had lost. This was the 16th of December, 1944, near a Belgian village called Lanzerath, on the first morning of the battle the world would come to call the Battle of the Bulge. Everyone knows the siege of Bastogne that came later. Almost no one knows what happened on the northern edge of that offensive, on a low wooded ridge above a road that Hitler's tanks needed to use. And here is the strangest part of the whole story. The men who held that ridge were captured, their radios were dead, and for 37 years no one, not even the US Army, knew what they had actually done. To understand why that ridge mattered, you have to understand Hitler's gamble. By December 1944, Germany was losing the war on every front. So Hitler bet everything on one surprise blow, a massive armoured thrust through the snowbound Ardennes forest, aimed at splitting the Allied armies and racing to the port of Antwerp. The spearhead of the whole northern attack was an SS Panzer army, and its lead columns needed to move fast on a tight timetable, down a handful of narrow roads. One of those roads ran right past Lanzerath, and above Lanzerath, on a ridge in the trees, sat an American platoon that was never supposed to fight at all. They were the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, part of the green and untested 99th Infantry Division. 18 men. Their job was to be the eyes and ears of the regiment, to scout, to watch, to gather information, and specifically to avoid a stand-up fight. They were led by a 20-year-old lieutenant named Lyle Bouck, one of the youngest officers in the entire US Army. On the night of December 15th, they dug into the frozen ground on the ridge above Lanzerath. It was the eve of Bouck's 21st birthday. None of them knew that the largest German attack in the West was about to break directly over their heads. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like, and stay with us all the way to the end. But before the barrage, it's worth knowing who these 18 men were, because it explains a great deal about what they were able to do. The INR platoon was not a random collection of riflemen. Its members had been handpicked, expert marksmen, in peak condition, many of them intelligent and well-educated, some from a college training program the army had shut down. In the weeks before the attack, they had run dangerous patrols behind German lines and manned lonely listening posts along the front. They were disciplined, they were close, and they trusted the young lieutenant who led them. All of that was about to be tested past any reasonable limit. Bouck had prepared the ground with care. On the ridge above the village, his men dug deep foxholes along the wood line, reinforced them with logs, and cut interlocking fields of fire across the open, snow-covered slope below. The white snow hid their positions beautifully. They had their rifles, a few automatic weapons, and a heavy 5th-caliber machine gun. They had been placed here to watch a gap in the American line and to warn of enemy movement. What they did not have was any expectation of holding it. A recon platoon was never meant to stop an army. They settled in to watch, in the bitter cold, and waited for the dawn. The dawn brought the end of the world. At 5:30 in the morning, all along an 80-mile front, the German offensive announced itself with a colossal artillery barrage, well over 1,000 guns firing at once. On the ridge, the men of the INR platoon pressed themselves into the frozen earth as the shells walked across the trees above them, shattering branches and shaking the ground. When at last it lifted, the sudden silence was almost worse. They climbed up in their holes, looked down the snowy slope toward the village, and waited to see what would come out of the smoke. What came was almost as bad as the shelling, their own side, leaving a small American tank destroyer force that had been posted in the village below, suddenly pulled out without a word to Bouck and drove away to the rear. In an instant, the 18 men on the ridge went from being one piece of a defended line to being the only Americans left in the sector, a lone island in the path of the German advance. Then, into the village below them, moving up the road in a long column, came hundreds of German paratroopers. The men on the ridge watched them come, held their fire and waited. Bouck did what a recon officer is supposed to do. He got on the radio to regimental headquarters, reported a large enemy column moving up, and asked permission to pull back and fight a delaying action. The answer that came back changed everything. He was told to hold his position at all costs. So he would. 4 artillery observers who had been in the village, among them a young man named Billy Queen, climbed up to join the platoon on the ridge rather than be overrun below. Now there were 22 Americans on that hill, and a German battalion of roughly 500 men forming up to come and take it. The first German attack came the way the platoon had prayed it would, straight across the open field. Ranks of paratroopers rose up and advanced up the snowy slope toward the wood line, bunched together, crossing the very ground the Americans had ranged their weapons on. Bouck held his men's fire until the enemy was close enough that no shot would miss. Then the ridge erupted. Rifles, automatic weapons, and the heavy machine gun tore into the packed ranks in the open. The attack shattered against the tree line and fell back down the slope. The 18 men had thrown back a force many times their size, and they had barely been touched. They did not, at first. Not understanding what they were up against, the Germans came again the same way, and again the concealed foxholes and the ranged guns cut them down in the snow. Twice, 3 times. The paratroopers massed and charged across the open, and each time the small American force broke the attack. Between assaults, a strange quiet would settle over the field, broken by the moans of the wounded and the shouts of officers trying to reorganize. The men on the ridge reloaded, redistributed their dwindling ammunition, and watched the tree line, knowing the enemy would have to come again, and knowing that sooner or later they would come smarter. Through it all, Bouck moved along the line, hole to hole, exposing himself to fire to steady his men and direct the defense. Beside him fought a young private named William James, a soldier so close to Bouck that the two shared a foxhole. Another, Sergeant Bill Slape, worked the automatic weapons until the barrels were nearly glowing. When the .50 caliber machine gun on the jeep was finally knocked out, they fought on with what they had. Bouck tried again and again to raise headquarters, to get artillery, to get help of any kind. The help never came. There was only the ridge, the cold, the snow, and the enemy gathering below for another try. Down in the village, the German commander was in an impossible position. His battalion was supposed to punch through here quickly and open the road for the tanks of the SS Spearhead behind him. Instead, his paratroopers were being cut to pieces in the snow by an enemy he could not see and could not count. Hour after hour, his timetable slipped away. The men on the ridge could not know it, but with every assault they broke, they were not just defending a hill. They were reaching back and grabbing the wheels of Hitler's entire northern offensive and dragging them to a crawl. What these men endured through that afternoon is the heart of the story. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. We're just getting to it. Because as the short winter day wore on, the situation on the ridge grew desperate. The platoon had been fighting almost without pause since morning. Ammunition was running low. Men were wounded and could not be evacuated. The cold was a second enemy, numbing hands and freezing the wounded where they lay. And still, every time the Germans came, the ridge answered, and every hour it held was another hour stolen from an offensive that depended on speed above all else. The Germans finally learned their lesson the hard way. Instead of charging across the open field yet again, they began to work around the flanks of the position, using the woods and the failing light to get close. For the men in the foxholes, the fight changed from a shooting gallery into something far more dangerous, an enemy that was no longer a target across a field, but a shape moving through the trees at the edge of the perimeter. The platoon's fire slackened as ammunition ran out. Weapons that had fired all day were down to their last rounds. The ring around the ridge was closing. At dusk, the end came fast. German paratroopers broke into the perimeter and moved from foxhole to foxhole, clearing them one by one. In the command hole, a burst of fire caught Bouck in the leg and gravely wounded the young private beside him, William James, in the face. Out of ammunition, out of contact, surrounded, and with most of the platoon wounded, there was nothing left to fight with. After nearly a full day, the ridge above Lanzerath fell silent, and the survivors, bloodied, exhausted, disbelieving, became prisoners of the men they had held off since dawn. When you weigh the two sides, the result is astonishing. Of the 22 Americans on the ridge, only one had been killed, the young artillery observer, Billy Queen. 14 of Bouck's 18 men were wounded, some of them badly, but they had survived. The German battalion that attacked them had been wrecked. The enemy's own official count put their losses at more than 90 killed, wounded and missing, and some accounts run far higher. 18 recon men and 4 artillery observers had held off roughly 500 elite paratroopers for the better part of a day, and had done it at the cost of a single life on their own side. And this is where the enemy becomes the witness to what those men achieved. When the Germans took the ridge, they did not race on down the road as their plan demanded. They stopped, convinced by the ferocity of the day's fighting, that the dark woods ahead must be packed with more Americans and tanks. They dug in and waited for help to clear a threat that had already been captured. The road stayed closed. The spearhead behind them sat stalled in the dark, its careful timetable in ruins, all because of a fight the Germans could not believe had been waged by so few. The man stuck behind them was one of the most dangerous officers in the German army, SS Colonel Joachim Paper, whose armored column was the tip of the entire northern offensive, ordered to race for the River Meuse and beyond. Pieper needed the road past Lanzerath open early. Instead, held up by blown bridges, jammed traffic, and the day-long fight on the ridge, his tanks did not push through the village until the small hours of the morning, roughly 12 hours behind schedule. When his men finally moved into those woods that had cost the paratroopers so much, they found them empty. The Americans who had done all that damage were long since captured and gone. 12 hours does not sound like much. In the Battle of the Bulge, it was everything. Hitler's plan depended on speed, on reaching the bridges over the Meuse before the Americans could react. Every hour of delay on the northern shoulder gave the U.S. Army time to rush reinforcements toward the threatened front. Pieper's spearhead, thrown off its timetable at the very start, never regained it. It ground forward, ran short of fuel, and was ultimately stopped and destroyed. The great blow that was meant to split the Allied armies failed on the northern shoulder, and the delay had begun on the first morning above a village called Lanzerath. But no one knew. That is the heartbreaking heart of this story. The men who had done it were prisoners of war, marched east into Germany, split between freezing, disease-ridden camps for 5 months until the war's end. Their radios had been dead. Their reports had never reached headquarters, and their capture meant no American commander could piece together what the ridge had cost the enemy. When the survivors came home, thin and sick, Lyle Bouck carried something heavier than his wounds. He was certain that he had failed. He had lost the ground. He had lost his men to captivity. He did not yet know that they had helped save the northern front. For years the story stayed buried. The men went back to ordinary lives. Bouck became a chiropractor in Missouri and almost never spoke of the war. His wife said later that he never talked about it, not once. Then, in the 1960s, the U.S. Army's official history of the Bulge mentioned the platoon only in passing, just a few lines. It was enough to light a fire. One of Bouck's men, William James, who carried his terrible wounds for the rest of his life, urged his old lieutenant to fight for the recognition the platoon had never received. Bouck began slowly to gather the proof of what 18 men had done in the snow above Lanzerath. It took the better part of 2 decades, letters, testimony, a congressional hearing, the patient assembling of a case for men the record had forgotten. And on the 26th of October, 1981, 37 years after the battle, it finally happened. In a formal ceremony, every single member of the platoon was decorated for the stand at Lanzerath. 4 men, including Bouck, received the Distinguished Service Cross, others the Silver Star, the rest the Bronze Star for valor. Every man received the Presidential Unit Citation. With that ceremony, the 18-man INR platoon became the most decorated American platoon of its size in the entire Second World War. Some of them did not live to see it or to enjoy it long. Billy Queen, the artillery observer, was the one man who never came off the ridge. He was the platoon's only fatality on that day, and he should be remembered by name. William James, the private who fought beside Bouck and was so badly wounded at the end, carried his injuries through dozens of operations until they finally took his life in 1977, before the medals were pinned. Lyle Bouck lived a long life, spent decades making sure his men were honored rather than himself, and died in 2016 at the age of 92. Above the village of Lanzerath today stands a small monument on the grassy ridge, a plaque, a bench, and an American flag, marking the ground where 18 men made their stand. 18 men, told to hold, who held all day against 25 times their number, and then went home believing they had failed. They had not failed. They had knocked the opening blow of Hitler's last offensive off its timetable, and some fights are won in the moment. This won the world 37 years to say so out loud. Some fights are won in the snow, and only counted a lifetime later. On my feast, people still debate what mattered most on the northern shoulder that winter: the recon platoon at Lanzerath, the stand at Elsenborn Ridge, the fuel that ran out, the reinforcements that arrived in time. Maybe you have a view. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served in the Battle of the Bulge, or anywhere in the European theatre in any unit, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, or said, or one thing you remember. The men who held that ridge deserve more than a line in a database. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.